Hey guys, welcome back to my Animal Adventures YouTube channel. And if you've been watching my last few videos, you know I've been talking about the genetic defects of ball pythons. And let me tell you, if you're a breeder and you breed enough snakes, you'll get a lot of really crazy stuff popping out. A lot of kink spines and assorted stuff that's some of it's really severe. And as a responsible breeder, really, if you have severe genetic defects, I believe it's your responsibility to properly euthanize the animal. And in this video, I'm going to show you the proper way to kill a snake. Alright, so you guys know I like to talk about the topics that nobody else is talking about, the really tough topics, and let me tell you, this is one of those topics. And I've been breeding animals for a long time, let me tell you. I think the first animal that I bred in mass was freshwater angelfish. And I used to hop from pet store to pet store, and I was really fascinated with animals at a really young age. And when one of the pet store owners came up to me and said, "Hey, would you like to breed angelfish for me? I sell a lot of angelfish," and he was having a problem with his supplier. And so I picked up a few tanks, and before you know it, I had like 30 aquariums, and I was cranking out thousands and thousands of angelfish every month, selling them to all the pet stores. And let me tell you, I had a lot of really weird, freaky fish coming out of those little baby angelfish. I had some that were two-headed and some that were all twisted and deformed. And really, I think as a breeder, you need to be kind of proactive in trying to figure out which ones are good enough to bring into the pet trade and which ones you really have to euthanize. And then further on down the road, a few years later, I actually got into breeding canaries, and that was a little bit tougher because it's I would say it's a little bit cuter, and it's I'd say you put more of a value on something that's a little bit bigger, and I think it's tougher to really euthanize a larger animal versus a small little fish that just kind of hatched out of the egg. And I actually had this line of canaries that had a problem with their feet, and I had one that was born with no legs. And it was kind of the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And we called him Scooter, the first one. And he would scoot around on the bottom, and it was really bad. He'd just scoot in his manure, and he'd get all caked up full of manure. And it was pretty awful. And then actually, I decided I actually had a few more of those pop out when I was breeding that had no legs. It was kind of a genetic defect in my line of canaries, and it was then that I decided to euthanize those birds. So back when I was breeding canaries, it was basically regulated by the Department of Agriculture here in Colorado. If I was on a larger scale, I would have had to pay permit fees and have inspections and the whole thing, but I was pretty much on a small scale and I didn't really go through all that. But I do remember a pamphlet that was put out by the Department of Agriculture that actually had recommendations on how to euthanize a bird. And I remember two things about it. I couldn't find it on the internet, but the two things I remember is they said, number one, don't freeze your animals, because if you just pop them in the freezer, apparently it's extremely painful for the animal. So that's not really a proper way to euthanize your animals. They said pretty much universal for all your animals, you want to use CO2 gas. And it's the same thing as dry ice. I've seen people use dry ice, but I use a little tank in a cylinder, and that's how I euthanized my canary. So that's pretty much my background as far as breeding animals on a larger scale with my fish and my canaries, and having to call out some of the really severe genetic defects. And as a matter of fact, I actually had to euthanize a snake once, and it was when I started early on. I had a few ball pythons, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to get into ball pythons or king snakes at the time. So I had, like 5 or 6 king snakes and 5 or 6 ball pythons. I was kind of mixing it up, and the weirdest thing happened. I had one of my king snakes. It was actually a California king that it was the banana phase. It actually had 2 of them. I was going to breed them together, and one of them, I don't know what happened to him, but he lost his eye. And then a few months later, he lost his other eye, and he was completely blind. And then like a month later, he started shedding some scales and just kind of falling apart. It was the weirdest thing I ever saw. And the only thing I can think of is maybe he was dying of old age and just kind of falling apart. I've never seen anything like it. It was really weird. And I decided at the time, since the snake had no eyes and he was really in rough shape, that I was going to euthanize him. And of course, my method of euthanization was CO2. So I put him in my little tank, my little enclosure, turned on the CO2, and I usually leave it on for 3 minutes. I turned it off, and I came back in like half an hour, and that snake revived. I couldn't believe it. So I actually gave him a second dose of CO2, and again, I plugged it up, and I kept him in there for like half an hour, and I pulled him out, and he came back to life. I could not believe that my snake survived 2 rounds of CO2, and let me tell you, when I'm euthanizing my rats, it's usually like 3 minutes and they are gone. The snakes are pretty incredible. Alright, so I know what you're probably thinking. You're thinking, if CO2 doesn't work, what is the proper method to use to euthanize my snake if it has severe defects, or in my case, if it had no eyes and it was falling apart? It was, for me, it was really sad because it was a really neat snake, and I felt like I had no other option at that point. And what I actually did is I used a combination of CO2, and what happens is the snake is totally unresponsive. You knock out that snake, and it's almost like you put the snake to sleep. And then I was putting that outside and actually using an axe on a stump and decapitating the snake. But the thing that I learned about that, which is really interesting, is that CO2 with a snake actually knocks them out. And I want to show you the snake right here. This is actually one of my only non-ball pythons that I have left in my collection. This is a Arizona mountain king snake, and she's been doing really good. She is so old. She's, I think, past her expected life. She's got a lot of really bad arthritis. She's actually been eating fairly well, and she's got a little bit better body condition. You can tell she's really kind of an old. She has a lot of arthritis through her body. Not very good body condition. She's almost to the point where it's definitely past the end of her life. I think they live about 10 years, and she's probably close to 12 years. She's a really old snake, and at this point, I don't even feel good about selling her because, I don't think she has that much time left, and she's a really picky eater. She's hard to really get to. She regurgitates a lot if you give her anything that's even has a decent size to it. But she's a really neat snake. I've had her for several years. And actually, I had a snake similar to this that I actually sold at the show. It actually recovered. But I was using these little moss balls for humidity, and I was using paper substrate in there. And what happened was the snake actually penetrated. It stuck its head in and out of the other side, and it was stuck in there between these little. It's like a little netting. It's used for like fruit, a little plastic netting. And what happened is when she went in there, threw it all the way, got stuck, and then the body of the snake actually swelled up around the plastic. And I picked up that snake, and I was trying to get it out, and that snake bit me so hard I couldn't believe it, and I could not get it out. And what I actually did is, I remember back when I tried to euthanize my king snake and knocking it out with CO2, and sure enough, I put my snake in a container, and I turned on the CO2 just enough until it lost consciousness. I was able to do a little surgery and get that netting off of the snake, and that snake snapped right out of it and was perfectly fine. Okay, so that wraps up my discussion of having to euthanize animals, the proper way to do it. And let me tell you, it's a pretty heavy burden that is placed on the breeder as far as trying to determine if a genetic defect is severe enough to actually consider euthanization. And I want to give you a quick snake update. I try to throw some snakes in at every opportunity on these videos, and I want to show you the tail end of my albino clutch. And this is my albino pied mixed with my albino het pied. And I was fortunate enough this year to produce this beautiful female albino pied. Take a look at that. This is one of my holdbacks that I'm holding back. And then I have 3 other snakes here that actually these were all assist fed. These were the tiniest little snakes, and they're actually doing really well. They're starting to eat live mouse crawlers, and hopefully I can get them on frozen thawed pretty soon. This one's a little bit bigger. This one almost looked like it would take a little frozen thawed, but they were real picky at first. I had to assist feed them quite a bit. This one's a really high contrast. It is really beautiful. And these snakes I'll definitely have for sale at one of the shows. I don't think they're quite ready for this next upcoming show. This one is definitely lagging behind. This is the one that it took a couple live mouse crawlers, and I was assist feeding this one quite a bit. I think I assist fed it like 5 times. It's been really picky. And one of them had a hard belly, and it survived. It actually came out of it. But look at how skinny that neck is on this one. I've never seen ball pythons that are that skinny. It's just incredible. And they were even skinnier than that. I couldn't even believe it. But they actually survived. It looks like they're going to pull through, and they will be awesome additions to my show table. Okay, so that wraps up my discussion of how to properly euthanize a snake. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.